Have you ever wondered just how our Earth got so green and when life actually moved out of the oceans and onto land to dominate terrestrial environments? Well, in this video, I'm going to be talking about when life moved to land and who moved to land first, second, third, fourth, fifth. But before we talk about when life moved to land, we kind of have to define land because continental shelves are continental crust, but they're covered in ocean and also covered in marine life. It is still technically marine, even though it's not oceanic crust, it is continental crust. But there are also transitional environments that can be thought of as kind of neither marine nor terrestrial, and they're, well, transitional. And they're beaches, lagoons, estuaries, deltas, and just things like that. You can see an image down here to the bottom right of a figure pointing out where these transitional environments are. And before life could take over terrestrial environments that were further inland, it did have to conquer these transitional habitats. And that is why we'll be talking about stromatolites first. By the late Archean Eon, around 3 billion years ago, several large continental blocks had formed, and that not only provided new continental environments for life, but also increased continental weathering. And that caused an increased flux of calcium and bicarbonate to the oceans, which eventually reacted with each other when enough got to the oceans to form stable carbonate continental platforms. So when you think of an oceanic margin, it's not necessarily just continental crust and oceanic crust. There's a lot that gets deposited on top of that. And much of that at the margins of the oceans is carbonate material, not only from abiotic precipitation and deposition, but also, especially today, biological secretion of carbonate material. All reefs, all shells you find on beaches, those are calcium carbonate. And their material makes up much of the sediment at oceanic margins. In any case, carbonate platforms were starting to form in many areas during this time, and by the Proterozoic, stromatolites were no longer restricted to shallow marine basins and could now also live in nearshore and intertidal settings, those transitional environments on these carbonate platforms, and also in epicontinental lakes and rivers. And stromatolites, which are cyanobacterial mats, came in a variety of structures. They weren't just, one type of stromatolite existed. It was quite a diverse community of stromatolites, and they also differentiated sometimes depending on the environment because different species built different forms of structures and different species liked different types of environments better than the other. And there were two major pulses of diversification of stromatolites or stromatolite form during the Proterozoic, or basically the eon right after the Archean, from 2.5 to 555 million years ago, somewhere in there. And those events happened in the Paleoproterozoic, the early part from 2.5 to 1.6 billion years ago. 180 different forms of stromatolites have been identified for that time range, and 1.3 to 1 billion years ago was the second diversification pulse, and that was where 340 different forms were found. And like I mentioned, the speciation and diversification of these forms was due to new habitable spaces coming available on continental shelves and also new species evolving. For example, the second major pulse with 340 different forms was larger than the first major pulse because of eukaryotic evolution, and eukaryotic algae contributed to these mats during that time, and so made different structures and different forms different from the purely prokaryotic forms of the Paleoproterozoic. But in any case, 3 billion years ago to about 1 billion years ago is a long time for terrestrial life, or even just transitional terrestrial life, to just be stromatolites. So what came after stromatolites and when did it happen? Well, this is where debate comes into play. The books I'm using don't even go into fungi and when land fungi came onto the scene, but I knew I had to include it because they're such a huge group of organisms, an important group of organisms for life today, and they really helped plants move to land later on and develop roots and a symbiotic relationship with these fungi, with their mycorrhiza, and I wanted to include them, so I went into the literature, and this whole slide is just based on papers, which I will link down below for you and number here on the slide so you can see which paper said what. But for a long time, it was thought that land fungi evolved around 500 million years ago and land plants around 480 million years ago. And I'll point these out as I go on this time scale to the right. We can see here that those times indicate an early Ordovician land fungi evolution and a mid-Ordovician land plant evolution. But in 2001, a group of researchers estimated an origin of land fungi at around 1 billion years ago and an origin of land plants around 700 million years ago. And as you can see here, I have this little parentheses thing that the first estimate was based on fossils, but then when genetics became advanced enough, we use this technique called the molecular clock, which is basically estimating when something should have evolved based on genetics and phylogeny and how things evolve. I don't know that much about it, so don't take my word for that, but I think that's how it works. And it is pretty sound and agrees with the fossil record really well. That's why we use it. But these estimates are quite off from each other. So which one do we go with? Well, later in 2009, another group of researchers estimated around 1 billion years ago to around 760 million years ago for land fungi. So quite a range for their estimate here. And another group in 2021 estimated 980 to 682 range for land plants. And again, these are all based on genetics and consider the fossil record, of course, but their genetic calculation is mainly what they used to make these estimates, because it's really hard to trust a broken up and incomplete fossil record, especially of soft organisms that don't preserve very well. In any case, of all of these estimates, whether land fungi appeared in the Proterozoic around 1 billion years ago, or in the Cambrian to Ordovician time range, they still appeared earlier than land plants. So we're just gonna go with the confirmed order of events and not confirm a date here because I can't tell you which one of these is correct. We're still working on it. As you can see, this last paper listed here is 2021. So we still don't know exactly when these things happened, but we have ideas, and that's what I'll be talking about here today. So moving to land plants now the land during this time was, wherever it was covered by algae, bacteria like cyanobacterial mats, and fungi, but they were still large areas of barren rock. And soils had little to no humus or organic material, because what are they going to make their organic material from? They only have a little bit of like fungi, algae, and cyanobacteria. They don't have plants yet. But in the Ordovician, plants finally moved to land. And if you remember, the Ordovician's over here from around 500 to, I think, 440 million years ago. However, there weren't any large plants with roots yet. So soil still remained pretty rocky until roots could evolve and really get in there. But by now, in the Ordovician, non-vascular plants like mosses had joined the land party. And before we move on, I should mention the 4 major evolutionary steps of plant evolution, just so you see where we're going here in the rest of this video. The origin of plants like algae and non-vascular plants like mosses came about first, because obviously you have to have an origin of something before it makes steps to more advanced species. But then you had vascular plants evolve in the second step. Then in the third step, seed plants evolved, because vascular plants were first seedless, and that limited them in ways I'll discuss in a second. Then you had seed plants, then you had angiosperms. We'll talk about all these first 3 steps today. However, angiosperms didn't happen till way after plants had already been on land for a while. And I talk about that in my Cretaceous video, specifically the Cretaceous Life or Cretaceous World video. I'll link it up here if you want to check it out. But other than angiosperms, we'll talk about all of these today. So what were these mosses or non-vascular plants on early Earth like? Well, have you ever noticed how much less effort it takes to stand upright in water than air? Well, plants had the same struggle. Land plants require a much more rigid stem than aquatic plants so that they can stand upright in air. The first land plants, however, didn't have roots and leaves, like I discussed, and couldn't transport nutrients efficiently or as efficiently as their eventual descendants of vascular plants could. They were pretty much just simple, rigid stems, but they actually did manage to change Earth pretty dramatically. Around 470 years ago is when non-vascular plants likely evolved in the mid-Ordovician based on fossil spores, and by the late Ordovician, glaciation had set in. How is the spread of these non-vascular plants over land related to this glaciation? Well, this expansion increased silicate weathering and nutrient flux to the ocean. This figure here is from a paper where they looked into how moss affects weathering and basically proved that andesite and granite, two main rock types of continental masses, weather much greater when there's moss around. And so we can see the green bars are the higher amount of weathering involved when moss is around for each of these major elements that were involved with the increased nutrient flux to the ocean, leading to not only carbonate precipitation because of increased calcium flux, but also increased primary productivity from the increased nutrient flux. And these two things caused increased inorganic and organic carbon burial, respectively. And carbon burial of any sort brings down atmospheric carbon levels, or atmospheric carbon dioxide levels specifically, which brings down the temperature, causing a cooling trend that can lead to glaciation like it did in the Ordovician. This actually led to one of the 5 major mass extinctions throughout Earth's history called the Late Ordovician Mass Extinction Event, and that is to be discussed in an upcoming video. So I'll leave it here for now and move on to the other things that moved to land, but I will talk about the Ordovician extinction in a separate video. Moving to vascular plants, by the time these guys were coming onto the scene, land was now inhabited by cyanobacteria, algae, fungi, and non-vascular plants. The importance of vascular plants and the reason they're called vascular plants is because they have something called vascular tissue, which helps to transport water and nutrients. In the early Ordovician, they were still relatively low and creeping forms that lacked well-developed roots and leaves. However, by the late Devonian, well-developed roots and leaves had evolved, and stems had also evolved larger or thicker vascular tissue proportions, meaning that they were more effective for fluid transport. So what does this mean? Well, if we look at the stem here in the xylem and phloem, I'm not a botanist, I don't know plant science, but I'm gonna go with that's how you pronounce those words. And basically, these were part of the vascular tissue proportions that transport water and nutrients through the stem and through the leaves and all of the things that it needs to transport nutrients and water to. But these proportions of the stems aren't always the same size, and they were getting thicker in the late Devonian when roots and leaves were also getting more well-developed, leading to more efficient transport of nutrients and water, which led to larger plants because, the larger, more well-developed leaves allowed them to grow larger because the leaves absorb sunlight and they're what's doing the photosynthesis and providing the plants nutrients. And then their more well-developed or far-reaching roots allowed them to move further away from water, but they still had to stay somewhat close to water because they were still seedless. And that meant that their reproduction was by spores. An example of a seedless vascular plant today is the fern, and these guys reproduce by spores as well. And this cycle of reproduction and the ultimate production of their spores requires moist environmental conditions because much of this process is external. However, that didn't stop trees from evolving in the mid-Devonian, even if they were no taller than around 10 meters or 30 feet, and they still were confined to swampy areas because of their seedless reproduction. They were still trees nonetheless, which was a really major accomplishment. However, large and woody trees hadn't evolved until the late Devonian, and these were called Archaeopteris, and they formed the world's first extensive forests. However, they were still seedless, so they were still confined to moist regions. However, seed plants were not far behind. By the time seed plants came on the scene, again, land was covered by algae, bacteria, fungi, and both non-vascular and vascular seedless plants. Seed plants, which evolved in the Devonian, allowed these plants to invade drier regions, and large woody trees expanded throughout these environments and formed the world's first forests in dry or well-drained areas where only barren land had existed before. Because these were seed plants, their fertilization process was internal and they didn't require external or environmental moisture to reproduce. So they didn't have to be next to a water body and they could basically cover the entire planet at this point. And today, most large plants that you see and think of are seed plants. And just like the Ordovician, the Devonian ended with glaciation due to this next plant milestone that happened during the Devonian. When vascular plants spread throughout the lands, a major increase in weathering and nutrient transport increased, again, carbon burial, which again decreased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and cooled the globe. This led to the second of the 5 major mass extinctions that have occurred throughout Earth's history. And this is going to be another separate video because this is, again, one of the major mass extinction events. So we'll talk about the late Ordovician extinctions and the late Devonian extinctions in 2 separate videos other than this one. But anyway, this also caused a mass extinction. Finally, moving to animals. By now, we've talked about land being covered by algae, cyanobacteria, fungi, non-vascular plants, and seed plants. Only after vascular plants were well established on land could animals follow because the animals needed something to eat or live in or under for the shade or environment or whatever. So this was building land life up the food web. However, invertebrate animals were able to predate vascular plants, but were able to actually move to land, at least in part, by the late Silurian after non-vascular plants had moved to land. These included in a first wave millipedes and wingless insects, and then in a second wave, scorpions and spiders then moved to land as well. And then eventually, after the Devonian brought vascular plants and other animals to land, many invertebrates invaded the land, but these were the earliest invaders of land. Moving to vertebrates, however, this is where things get really interesting. So as we know, the Devonian was the age of fish, and this is because fish just went crazy with diversification and radiation during the Devonian, not only in the ocean, but getting slightly out of the ocean, which I'll talk about in a second. But one major reason that fish were able to diversify and get really large during the Devonian was the oxygenation that was caused by the increase in carbon burial due to the spread of plants in the Devonian. Like I've talked about in previous videos, carbon and oxygen have an interrelated relationship where when one is being buried in large amounts, the other is being sourced to the atmosphere in large amounts. It's not always the case, but many times that is. And during this time, the increase in organic carbon burial was causing an increase of oxygen in the atmosphere and oceans, allowing large fish with high oxygen demands to thrive. If we're talking about the transition to land, however, we must focus on lobed-finned fish. These fish were primed for the transition to land because they had both land-like traits and marine-like traits. They had both lungs and gills and many other transitional type traits, and lobe-finned fish eventually did lead to the evolution of amphibians. This guy over here to the right is Tiktaalik. Now, Tiktaalik is amazing because it was not a true lobe-finned fish and not a true amphibian. It was a transitional species, and there were probably many of these for every single major transition and evolution throughout Earth's history, but they're really hard to find in the rock record because the fossil record isn't complete. So the finding of this guy was really awesome. And I actually have a book that I love that talks about this discovery and the stories behind it. And it's not even really like sciencey. It's more like just the stories behind finding Tiktaalik and its importance and everything. It's called Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, and it's linked in my description below if you want to check it out. But anyway, Tiktaalik had both fish and amphibian traits, and it couldn't walk great over land, but could prop itself up to view surroundings on the margin of the water. It also had both lungs and gills, and it could even breathe out of its eye sockets, which were positioned like on top of its head. So if it was like raising its head out of the water just a little bit like an alligator or crocodile, then it could breathe out of its eyes. But why wasn't this transition made sooner? Well, amphibians required shade for their sensitive skin, and that's one reason why plants had to move to land before animals could, because amphibians had to be that first step, and they had very sensitive skin, and therefore wanting to retain as many of their aquatic or semi-aquatic traits to gain protection in the water from the sunlight. But when plants evolved and trees especially evolved, like canopy cover, these amphibians could move out of the land and be protected. However, they were still restricted to moist regions where they could keep their eggs in water, because the transition to amniote eggs wasn't until after amphibians, and their eggs had to be kept in water. And also, like I mentioned, they wanted sun protection in the water when shade wasn't available. But eventually, like I talk about in my late Paleozoic or Carboniferous life video, amphibians evolved into reptiles with the evolution of amniotic eggs, allowing them to move further away from water bodies because their eggs were already protected in their own little personal pond and they didn't need to be in an actual pond. And then eventually reptiles evolved into mammals, birds, etc. And these were fully terrestrial organisms. Again, it started with Tiktaalik, which led to things like Ichthyostega, which was one of the super early amphibian species that came from Tiktaalik or Tiktaalik-like ancestors. And then eventually Dimetrodon organisms, which were a type of mammal-like reptiles called synapsids, eventually did lead to the evolution of mammals. And also, reptiles led to the evolution of birds eventually, but not through Dimetrodon. So this arrow is a little bit wrong here, but I want to point out that that's just to represent the transition from reptile to bird, not the transition of Dimetrodon to bird, because that wasn't a transition. It was from an earlier reptile ancestor that bird ancestors evolved, and then eventually birds. And the Dimetrodon type of reptiles were the ancestors of mammals, not birds. But in any case, this is the general order. And just to summarize and put on a timeline what we've talked about today and when it happened, we had the stromatolites on carbonate platforms by late Archean to early Proterozoic, and then throughout the Proterozoic, they kept on diversifying in those environments because those environments kept on diversifying. And then fungi came on the scene anywhere from 1 to 1.3 billion years ago, all the way to potentially 500 million years ago, although I think most of the more recent estimates are like 1 billion to like 700-ish million years ago. So probably not 500, probably earlier. But anyway, fungi is a range of time we're still unsure. And then we had non-vascular plants come on the scene in the mid-Ordovician around 480, 470 million years ago. And then invertebrate animals coming on the scene in the Silurian, so those millipedes and wingless insects and whatnot. Then seedless vascular plants, seed plants, and vertebrate animals all coming in the Devonian, which went from around, I think, 420 million years ago to 360-ish million years ago. So in that time range, all of these major events happened. And like I mentioned, the non-vascular plants contributed to the Ordovician extinctions, and the vascular plants contributed heavily to the Devonian extinctions. And we'll talk about those in upcoming videos, or potentially they're out on my channel by now. By the time you're seeing this, I don't know when you're watching this, but like always, my major references for this and other videos in this geobiology playlist is Introduction to Geomicrobiology by Kurt Konhauser, and this is linked in my description below if you want to check it out. I'm also using for this video specifically the Earth System History book that I use for my historical geology playlist because it talks about more of the non-micro land transitions. However, neither of these books talk about the fungal transition to land, so I will link the papers down below that were numbered on that slide so you can see what paper said what about the fungal transition to land and when that occurred and how they calculated that. But anyway, if you want to check out any more of the geobiology videos, you can click the playlist down below whenever it pops up. And if you want to check out any of the historical geology playlist videos, you can check that out on my channel too. I talk about historical events like the Ordovician mass extinction, Devonian mass extinction. Those things will be in my historical geology playlist. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!